Did you happen to watch President Zelensky of Ukraine's address to a joint session of Congress in December? I did. And I saw a moment, and I saw a leader. I saw someone who is facing a titanic opponent and who knew that he'd been given an enormous challenge and opportunity in the span of 30 minutes. There, amongst the well-fed, well-dressed, warm and secure audience, he made his case. But not just his case, the case for millions whose hopes, dreams, and wishes and very survival hinged on what he said, how he said it, and how it was received. I think he knew that in that moment, his actions in front of that relatively small assembly held the fate of his people. I believe meeting a moment defines a leader. It's what I admire and recognize and hold out as one of their virtues. Somehow, despite personal danger, loss, and challenges, leaders are able to call to us, to somehow reach us, to help us see a better place. They call to our better selves, if even just for a moment. Their voices roll down through history, cutting through like thunder before a storm, warning us, reminding us, and showing us by the sacrifices they must make that prophetic words can be met by life-changing deeds, and that the future is not yet written. That, to me, is a true leader. They are able to meet a moment, and it isn't always necessary for it to be live-streamed from the center of power and influence in the modern world. President Zelensky did that for about 30 minutes, and so did Martin Luther King Jr. some 60 years ago, from inside a jail cell in a small, racially torn southern city, where with a pen and paper, he met another moment with his letter from inside a Birmingham, Alabama jail. Dr. King's letter was written in longhand or cursive. It takes about 30 minutes or so to read it, and it's clear to me that its message was meant for a far wider audience than those 8 Birmingham-based faith leaders whose editorial prompted its writing. In Dr. King's letter, I heard 3 messages rolling down through history, cutting through the years like thunder before a storm. I heard the same message loud and clear inside President Zelensky's speech, at once a call to our better selves and a warning. First, that our world is interconnected, and that the actions of one affect many. Second, that it's long past time that we tackle together the toughest issues that divide us. And third, that great prophetic words and aspirations must be met by deeds. Deep into Dr. King's letter, his words from 1963 leapt off the page. I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states, he writes. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what's happening in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. 60 years later, President Zelensky reminds us again that we are living in one world. From the United States to China, from Europe to Latin America, and from Africa to Australia, he said. The world is too interconnected and interdependent to allow someone to stay aside and at the same time to feel safe when such a battle continues. In my mind's eye, I imagine a 1963 newspaper reader landing on Dr. King's letter, or like me today, watching President Zelensky's speech on their phone. While these interconnections may seem fine in the abstract, something else nagged at me. I've heard it over and over again. The world is shrinking. We are living on one planet. It's true. At least I think it's true that what we do to and with each other matters more than ever, and indifference is not an option. If I turn away from ugliness, it doesn't change. If I avoid glancing at the unsheltered, they remain unsheltered. And if I ignore the cries of my neighbors, my cries are ignored as well. The cries for justice are inconvenient. President Zelensky entered into a discussion that many would rather not have, talking about war during Christmas and Hanukkah. For God's sake, couldn't he give it a break? Some said. Dr. King's distractors asked him, "Is it possible you are in too great of a religious hurry? All Christians know that colored people will receive equal rights eventually. It has taken Christianity almost 2,000 years to accomplish what it has. The teachings of Christ take time to come to earth, Dr. King." But that's what leaders do. They encourage us and challenge us and persuade us to enter into discussions of a reality we would sometimes rather overlook, or at least I would rather overlook. I don't know about you, but I have to admit that there are times I'd rather stay in ignorance than enter into discussions of reality. I have a strange reaction to anyone showing up I don't know who begins a discussion of my shortcomings and where I might improve. I go into a defensive crouch when I'm called out, much like those presumably and otherwise decent Birmingham clergy who called Dr. King out. And I recently had an encounter with that I think we can all remember during our own discussions of our eighth principle. More on that in a moment. Dr. King calls out his detractors in exaggerated fashion, forcing a kind of hoped-for self-reflection. He writes, "You say that you deplore the demonstrations that are presently taking place in Birmingham, but I am sorry that your statement did not express similar concern for the conditions that brought the demonstrations into being. I am sure that each of you would want to go beyond the superficial social analyst who looks merely at effects and does not grapple with underlying causes, he writes, and continues, I would not hesitate to say that it is unfortunate that so-called demonstrations are taking place in Birmingham at this time, but I would say in more emphatic terms that it is even more unfortunate that the white power structure of this city left the Negro community with no other alternative. And President Zelensky used a similar tactic to call out the unjust suffering of his people today. They threw everything at us, he said, similar to the other tyranny which in the Battle of the Bulge threw everything it had against the free world, just like the brave American soldiers which held their lines and fought back against Hitler's forces during the Christmas of 1944. Brave Ukrainian soldiers are doing the same to the enemy forces this Christmas. Ukraine holds its line and will never surrender. The reaction Dr. King received from his fellow religious leaders, being labeled an outside agitator or troublemaker, echoed in the criticism some hurled at President Zelensky after his speech. Some called him a welfare queen. Others slammed him for showing up in a tracksuit, all somehow ignorant or pretending to be ignorant of his reasons for being there. This hit home for me and reminded me of our own congregation's struggle around the Unitarian eighth principle. For you non-Unitarians, you may not be familiar with our principles, our covenant, that we hold out as that which defines our faith and how we move together in the world. There are 7 principles adopted years ago, which will soon be joined by an 8th. It states that we affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community, by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. It was that call to dismantle that odious condition in ourselves that generated much discussion and wringing of hands, a pearl-clutching moment, if you'll allow me. That admission, before being wholly embraced by our congregation, got stuck for a moment in our collective throats. I think it's because it's one thing to have principles and quite another to match those principles with deeds. Great leaders know it takes more than words to create change, that great prophetic words must be met by deeds. It's never the right time for progress, and it's never convenient for the privileged to see that their positions, their image of self, and all that they believe is built on the deprivation of others. That's never welcome news, and woe be it to the news bringers. There's a long list of those who have paid the ultimate price, including Dr. King. How I wish words were enough to convince me to change, but I need more. When a leader meets a moment to me, I need to feel it, not just hear it. They need to touch my whole body, my spirit, and my mind. Reaching down through 60 years, I ask myself, why are Dr. King's words so powerful today, as powerful today as when they were written? And he writes, and makes me understand why. When you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, brutalize, and even kill your black brothers and sisters with impunity, when you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro living constantly at tiptoe stance, never knowing what to expect next. I hope, dear sirs, he deadpans, can understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience. And President Zelensky shared his reality with us. The enemy's military and mercenaries have been attacking nonstop since May. They are attacking by day and night. Last year, 70,000 people lived there in Bakhmut, and now only a few civilians stay. Every inch of that land is soaked in blood. Roaring guns sound every hour. Trenches change hands several times a day in fierce combat and even hand fighting. So here is the front line, he says. The tyranny, which has no lack of cruelty, against the lives of free people. President Zelensky continued, "This struggle will define in what world our children and grandchildren will live, and then their children and grandchildren. It will define whether it will be a democracy for Ukrainians and for Americans and for all. This battle cannot be frozen or postponed. It cannot be ignored, hoping that the ocean or something else will provide protection." In those words, today I hear a warning like thunder before a storm. I can also hear Dr. King's words. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And so, great leaders' words must be met by deeds, and sometimes with the ultimate price only a human can offer. Dr. King paid that price. President Zelensky may yet escape that fate, yet he knows too well the hollowness of words when bombs are falling and his people are dying. So as our hymn says, once to every soul and nation comes the moment to decide in the strife of truth with falsehood for the good or evil side. Dr. King's final words from his letter written inside that cramped and dingy cell, delivered today on our beautiful chancel, ring out to me. He writes, "If I have said anything in this letter that is an understatement of the truth and is indicative of an unreasonable patience, I beg you to forgive me. If I've said anything in this letter that is an overstatement of the truth and is indicative of my having a patience that makes me patient with anything less than brotherhood, I beg God to forgive me." Great leaders and prophets and visionaries call us to three things: They remind us that our world is interconnected, that it is long past time to right the wrongs we have inherited, and that great prophetic words, aspirations, and values must be met by deeds and sometimes great sacrifice. Amen.